One thing that I often think about is that adolescents often look like adults. You know, they go through puberty and they go through growth spurts, and yet their brains are not adult yet. Their brains are very plastic and developing very profoundly. This means that they are good at learning new information. They're particularly creative, for example. But it is a biological change, and we need to take that into account and be maybe a bit more understanding about adolescent development. I'm Sarah Jane Blakemore, and I run a lab that investigates the development of the adolescent brain.
20 years ago, everyone thought teenagers were just crap adults. In fact, most people still do. But scientists know now that our brains are different to adult brains, and that's okay. That's a good thing. They're meant to be like that.
I became really interested in various different forms of adolescent typical behaviour, for example, risk-taking and self-consciousness, but I also became particularly interested in social cognition. So that's like making a decision, but when you're thinking about what your friends think of you. Hi. I was interested in what happens in the brains of teenagers who then go on to develop schizophrenia. That was about the year 2001. My surprise when I looked at the literature, there was virtually nothing known about how even the typically developing brain changes during the period of adolescence, let alone teenagers who then go on to develop schizophrenia. So it was around that point that I started to become really interested in this question, and a couple of years later changed the focus of my own lab's research and started to investigate the development of the typically developing adolescent brain. For many years before we were able to scan children and teenagers with MRI, let's call them teenage typical behaviours, were all put down to kind of moodiness or this age group being difficult or whatever. But actually what people didn't realise is these enormous changes going on in the brain during the teenage years. And now we know that by using MRI scanning to see the inside of the living human brain and to track changes in brain structure and function across the lifespan, we can start to understand teenage typical behaviour in terms of underlying changes in the brain. So that's the prefrontal cortex, and then there are other parts of the social brain which we're really interested in the cortex on both sides. So one is the top of the superior. So adults and adolescents generate different levels of activity in different regions of their social brain when they do mentalising tasks. But what's interesting is that in all of these different studies that showed that, task performance was matched between the two age groups. So it's not that adolescents are particularly finding these tasks harder than adults, and yet nevertheless they generate different levels of activity. And one idea is that they might be using a different cognitive strategy to do these kinds of tasks. For example, perhaps thinking about other people's mental states, their minds, their emotions becomes more automatic as you get older, as you become an adult. Another question which is related is, how does behaviour change during adolescence, and how is that related to the changes that are happening in the brain? We were really interested in why adolescent decision making is often different when they're with their friends compared with when they're on their own. We worry about adolescents taking risks like taking up smoking or binge drinking. Now, if you think about the situation in which adolescents take those risks, it's more often than not when they're with their friends, not when they're on their own. If you take, for example, a 13-year-old girl who's very intelligent and educated, knows all about the health risks associated with smoking, if she's, say, out on the weekend with her big group of friends, they're all smoking cigarettes and they offer her a cigarette. For her, what's the more risky decision? Saying yes to a cigarette, knowing, as she does, that cigarettes carry a significant health risk, or saying no and potentially being ostracised by her peer group? Well, what we're arguing in my lab is that we really need to think about how risky it is for an adolescent to risk being excluded by their peer group. And what we're arguing is that fear of being excluded by one's peer group is a big driver of adolescent typical decision making. I've worked with lots of teenagers over the last 15 years. One of the projects that I've been working on recently is a collaboration with the Islington Community Theatre. But it feels like you've got all the kind of essence of... And And they have, for the last 2 years, been creating a play about the teenage brain. This is a play that is written by teenagers and performed by teenagers.
Look at Michael. Look at Dwayne. If you're watching this as a teenager right now, look at them too.
This is a really great example of real public engagement. It's not about just teaching the public about how the brain changes during the teenage years. It's really a dialogue between us scientists and the teenagers. Working with adolescents, from my own personal point of view, has really changed my attitude towards this age group. And I think about my own teenage years, and I think, it would have been really useful to know that the brain changes so much during adolescence. This is a time where cognitive development and brain development undergoes a lot of change, very gradual change, where you're building a kind of representation of yourself, and particularly a sense of how other people see you. My view is that adolescence, part of the whole point of adolescence, this very protracted period in humans, is to develop a sense of self, a sense of self-identity, who you are, how other people see you, and particularly a sense of social self. That's what adolescence is for. It's to become an independent adult and for other people, your peers, to understand what kind of person you are. My kids know lots about how their brains are changing already. We talk about it a lot, and they already know lots about the adolescent brain. So the other day, my 8-year-old was messing around, and I told him to stop messing around, and he said, "It wasn't my fault, it was my brain that made me do it." My heart sank slightly. I thought, oh God, I've given way too much information about their brains.